1.3 Extra-Galactic Terror. They knew that every system, whether mechanical or biological, eventually runs down. The Tyranids had found the only possible remedy for this. They moved from galaxy to galaxy, harvesting fresh, newly evolved DNA with which to renew and reinvigorate their own. They were the universe's ultimate life form. Quite possibly they had existed forever, and would continue to exist forever. Mark Gascoigne and Andy Jones, Dark Imperium, 2001. The cosmos is simply a perpetual rearrangement of electrons, which is constantly seething, as it always has been and always will be. Our tiny globe and puny thoughts are but one momentary incident in its eternal mutation. H.P. Lovecraft, Letter to Frank Belknap Long, 8th November 1923. Life, as we have formulated it so far, is subdued by the forces of time and space, and yet the intensive interiority of the viral seems to challenge these bounds, as does the externality of the fungal. The question that remains is, what is life? What is the force of life? And what are the forces that act on life? The task is to answer these questions without venturing too much towards the immaterial or unscientific. The issue becomes the thinkability of life, thinking life, and the life of thought. Or, put in other words, how do we define life? What is it about life that allows it to think? And what is the future of thought's rootedness in life? We will pursue these issues through fictional superorganic entities. The superorganic is conceptually constructed by combining the devastating emergence of the minuscule, such as the virus, coupled with the spatial expansion found in the fungoid. It is, in other terms, the exacerbated capacity of the swarm on a colossal scale. As was discussed in the introduction, the swarm is the form of life that presents itself as most problematic for thinking, both by producing the results of thought without intelligence. We observe non-thinking entities acting as if they can think, and as being hard to think as life. We are not sure if the swarm itself is a thing. As we saw in the introduction, because of the indeterminacy between the part and the whole of life. The hybridization of the viroid and fungoid, creating a life that transmogrifies and creeps, can be tied to the theory of exogenesis. The theory of exogenesis holds that life has always already existed and that life on Earth has come from elsewhere. At some point in the distant past, a Gaia spore, or object carrying early forms of, or the necessary ingredients for creating life, would have reached the early Earth, seeding it. Concepts of panspermia have been suggested for hundreds of years. The theoretical biologist Friedrich Kielmeyer suggested such a concept in the 1800s. While romantic notions of cosmic ancestry can be taken from such a concept, the more troubling suggestion is the possible age of certain forms of life and the rampancy of any particular form of extremophile, of a creature which can exist in seemingly impossible conditions. The fungal spores of last chapter and the viroids of the first being examples of such life forms. As we have seen, however, empirical and speculative biology provides ample evidence in favor of such a conceptualization of rampant life. Anxiety about the bounds of a biological life and the fragility of any one form of species being is unearthed by the extinct traces of animals, and exacerbated by the science fictive, particularly in terms of an array of insectoid superorganisms, a tradition begun by the endoparasitoidic, parasitic to the point of death, xenomorph of the Alien series. The xenomorph has a distinctly Lovecraftian genealogy, as the creature's design came from a work by the surrealist artist H.R. Giger titled Necromicon, named after the central fictional text of strange demonological lore by the invented mad Arab Abdul Alhazred, which describes the Cthulhu mythos, the grimoire of strange ancient monstrosities which populate the universe as well as dimensions outside of it, entities such as the Great Old Ones. The xenomorphs imitate hive-minded insects as they mindlessly follow the orders of their queen and act only to propagate their vile species. The Lovecraftian influence comes from the weird and amorphousness of alien life which he created. Aliens with almost imperceptible forms and near godlike powers. The result of Lovecraft's mythos is the minimization of the human race, a depressive expansion of the great chain of being, where instead of an omnipotent god at one end, with humans not far beneath, there is only an ever-stretching stream of entities, with humanity lost in its perilous contortion. Or, as Gould points out via Freud, each scientific advance means the further existential dethronement of Homo sapiens in the universe. This lostness and dethronement is redoubled temporally following the natural history of Carl Friedrich Kielmayer, who, through his focus on extinction events, revealed a nature in which humanity's place is not only tenuous due to other possible organisms, but due to the small span of time we have occupied. For Kielmayer, a species' ability to reproduce, to fill time, is what might guarantee its future survival. As Michel Houellebecq writes in H.P. Lovecraft, Against the World, Against Life, it is possible, in fact, that beyond the narrow range of our perception, other entities exist, other creatures, other races, other concepts, and other minds. Amongst these entities, some are probably far superior to us in intelligence and in knowledge, but this is not necessarily good news. Lovecraft contorts the very concept of a taxonomy to its temporal and spatial limits, submitting to us that organic life itself barely gets in the way of the cosmic course of time and space. When he writes, "We imagine that the welfare of our race is the paramount consideration, when, as a matter of fact, the very existence of the race may be an obstacle to the predestined course of the aggregated universes of infinity." Under Lovecraft's indifferentism, humans become just another form of matter in the universe, simply another form of entropic fodder in a mechanistic cosmos. Lovecraft's indifference is deeply connected, as S.T. Joshi has shown, to his commitment to the work of Ernst Haeckel. Haeckel was a zoologist in Germany at the turn of the 20th century, known widely for his recapitulation theory, which states that an organism in development went through the developments of the particular species on the whole. Haeckel, in at least partial agreement with Weismann, states that individual life is generally sacrificial, as only a small fragment of life at large. Lovecraft's materialism, again following Joshi, becomes, after some time, far more obscured than Haeckel's. Yet Haeckel's germplasm maintains a Lovecraftian flavor, in that life in general is a force that cannot be reduced to particular organisms, with organisms only being an excrescence, a bud, a sprout. The important point of Lovecraft's bestiary is not that he designated his creatures as not supernatural, but as supernormal, keeping nature in all its monstrous capacity. Lovecraft speaks of the tension between the natural and the unnatural in his short story, The Unnameable. He writes, "If the psychic emanations of human creatures be grotesque distortions, what coherent representation could express or portray so gibbous and infamous a nebulosity as the spectre of a malign chaotic perversion, itself a morbid blasphemy against nature?" Lovecraft explores exactly the tension outlined at the beginning of this chapter between life and thought. At the end of his short tale, Lovecraft compounds the problem, as The Unnameable is described as a gelatin, a slime, yet it had shapes, 1,000 shapes of horror beyond all memory. Another realm where thought insufficiently grasps the rampancy of biological life is the often unimaginative work of xenobiologists. As Jack Cohen and Ian Stewart discuss in Alien Science, much of contemporary xenobiology is so narrow as to exclude organisms that exist on the Earth, creatures capable of thriving in extreme environments, such as near heat vents, or fungus inside the lightless interior of the Chernobyl sarcophagus. That is, the criteria for alien life would pass over many species already identified here on Earth. It would be safe to say that the speculated xenobiological capacities of life are underestimated, whereas in the science fictive, the organic is exacerbated to the extreme. From the Tyranids of Warhammer 40,000 to the Zerg of StarCraft, to Species 8472 of Star Trek, to the Yuuzhan Vong of Star Wars, the rampant organic becomes the most threatening form of life, as a pure life or life as mutagen, which is always inadmissible to the intergalactic bodies of government. Furthermore, the transformation of the organic as hidden internality in the germinal or the viroid, moving towards externality as only a kind of unfolding in the Deleuze-Guattarian sense, is externalized as a form of techne, as an exterior painting of the swarming absolute. Put another way, the biological is seen as only a base that, when overly expansive, is grotesque, where civilization is the appropriate externalization of a life form's creative capabilities. In other words, any continuous evolution of an alien species requires a technological separation between uncivilized organicism and cultured, technologized life. In other words, the minute ungroundings of the microorganic, growth and decay, meet the planetary ungroundings of the monstrous, whether organic or inorganic, in the science fictive. Of all the aforementioned fictional species, the richest is the Tyranids. The Tyranids are an alien race from the cold depths of the void that hunger constantly for warm flesh. They infest the stars in their billions, a raw force of destruction that has been likened to a locust swarm. Whereas Lovecraft's Cthulhuid Old Ones programmatically tampered with the dwindling destiny of the human race by manufacturing certain protoplasmic masses on Earth, the Tyranids are not so patient, treating the human race as merely another form of biological matter to be absorbed. This gelatinous origin is invoked by Bergson's Creative Evolution, where he states that if there is a connectivity to all life, it is in this original slimy moment. In the backstory for the nightmarish race, which appears as a massive body of claws and talons, once a world's defenses have been sufficiently beaten back and deadly spores have been spread across the planet, the Tyranids consume all the biomass on the planetoid, rendering it in pools of acid. This gruel forms the fuel and material for future Tyranid mutates, so they can continue their onslaught across the inhabited systems of the universe. The Tyranid's unstoppable march across inhabited space questions the limit of the concept of ecosystem and of ecospace in particular. Can all the inhabited universes make up one bit of ecospace? Can one species fill it all? By the civilized races of the universe, the Tyranids are considered a monstrosity, as something fundamentally opposed to progressivity. That is, the Tyranids, despite their sentience, at least on a hive level, if not on an individual level, are considered as a non-civilization, given their rabid mutative nature. Tyranid technology is of course non-separable from their biological contours. It seems technological only in that it seems it should be separated. As Henri Bergson notes, one of the fundamental issues separating humans from other animals is the separation of technology from the body, from instinctual behaviors. To connect back to our viral chapter, alien invasion films such as War of the Worlds and Independence Day, the viral and or bacterial is the only thing that is capable of circumventing alien technologies, whereas the Tyranids are an extension of the viral itself. But since the viral nature of the Tyranids is extended to the height of intergalactic war, their gross mindlessness is somehow worse than unjust or perverse motivations for war, because even malicious reason is still reason, because the operation of thought is ontologically raised above the biological. Why is the species being of the Tyranid nightmarish, whereas the warmongering nature of humans and other species is absolved of a certain horribleness, given the avenues of religion, politics, nationality, and so forth? The horrible extended internalness of the Tyranid, that is, the revolting extension of the biological to the level of what is commonly thought of as removed from us, technology, war machines, etc., becomes only a natural extension. The primordial sliminess of being is thus returned through via the overextension of the biological in the speculative monsters of the Tyranids. This sliminess is accentuated in the lack of free will amongst the Tyranids, as free will is thought as an outgrowth of nature that escapes its bounds, a part of nature that is, at its center, unnatural. The following passage sums these themes up nicely. Tyranids travel the galaxies and the voids between them in vast, drifting hive fleets. These consist of millions of sentient craft, each in turn home to untold numbers of monstrosities evolved from the bubbling geno-organs of their mucus-slicked reproductive chambers. At some point, biology is expected to give in to the force of reason as itself exterior to it, in a seemingly impossible way. As Grant says, following Oken, the culmination of biology is the destruction of individuals, which is held in check so long as there remains something. Given human egocentrism, this something is often viewed as intelligence. The question becomes that of intelligence, and in particular reason, as taking over the biological, but the concept of the swarm, again, of emergence, causes problems for any deliberate cleavage. Cohen and Stewart argue that intelligence is a universal, yet such universality has no metaphysical implications. The issue is not to assert that intelligence must happen, but that intelligence, what Cohen and Stewart define as the ability to manipulate world models, tends to happen. Extelligence, the ability to externalize our intelligence, to record what has been done so humans need not reinvent all of what they have done with the death of every generation. Yet how does one separate the exteriority of intelligence from extelligence? That is it a clear matter of separating what seems to be a result of thought and the thinking in terms of the organic? Given the capacities of intelligence, is it possible to avoid the valorization of intelligence, the celebration of intelligence over nature, since we need intelligence to think it? Or can nature be saved as the productive engine of all intelligence? No one expounded the possibility of the former view more strongly than Fichte, and no one pursued the latter more admirably than as the nature philosopher W.F.J. von Schelling. Schelling made motions towards unbinding thought, though we must remain cautious of his potentially romantic inclinations. Schelling argued that nature reflected the work of intelligence, since it had to eventually, in a merely practical way, allow for the eventual emergence of thinking. As soon as humans are separated from nature, Schelling warned, nature becomes a dead object. In Schelling's ideas for a philosophy of nature, he posits the absolute as the unity of thinking and nature. The unity of the real and the ideal is both real and ideal in an identitarian way. That is, in terms of a thought simultaneity, but not a temporal or historical simultaneity. That is, the withdrawnness of nature restricts the ideal, but the ideal also moves forward in time. Put more directly, while nature precedes thinking, we can think nature as unified, both in a real sense. Thought is produced by brains, which are the result of long and slow evolutionary processes, and is part of nature. But thought is both ideally unified with nature because thought can produce like nature produces, in a seemingly uninhibited fashion. Schelling is often relegated as a mere philosophical stepping stone between the idealism of Fichte and the dialectic of Hegel. Fichte asserted the entire complex of nature as the not-I, as that which merely opposes itself to the capabilities of the I, of the self. Hegel can be seen as taking this idealism to its logical limit, not opposed the I and not I, but by setting up nature as a kind of exhausted spirit being what propels the self, the I. In both accounts, nature is given little appreciation, reduced to either an obstacle or as a byproduct of the work of the self. Schelling, on the other hand, particularly in his early works, is adamant about the necessary material precondition of all thought and all being. If nature is completely indifferent to human existence, how is it then that intelligence is removed from the developments of nature? How does the concept of valorized intelligence manifest itself? Warren Fay's fragment provides an interesting account of the perceived division, in terms of value, between intelligence and the biological. In the novel, an isolated island is discovered where evolution has taken a very different path, producing highly unusual creatures such as disc-shaped ants, eight-legged spider cats, and carnivorous plants. A group of scientists speculate as to how the bizarre species came to be, with one invoking a radicalized view of Haeckel. The human villain of the story, Thatcher Redmond, proposes that the hyperviolent biosphere of the island is perfect because it is absent of an intelligent species, his theory being that humans are the biggest threat to the Earth because of their intelligence. He states that intelligent life is an environmental cancer. Redmond's theory falls apart when the expedition team discovers, and is saved by, an intelligent life form which the scientists decide they must save from the looming nuclear bombardment, simply because the creature's intelligence makes it more human. The narratological shift in attitude, based on the discovery of the intelligent ape in the novel, betrays its initial Lovecraftian aspects, immediately becoming a humanist celebration of life and of the capacity of intelligence to stabilize life, lending itself to an uncritical ecological positivity. Fay's dismissal of the capacities of radical biology in the face of intelligence in popular fiction confirms Schelling's misgivings surrounding the dominant treatment of nature in philosophy. This treatment denies that nature is prior to thinking, that the ideal must be explained through the real, and that man sublates nature, placing ourselves at the peak of its production. Schelling's genetic philosophy of nature is situated in the Romantic era of science, creating a tension between the scientific investigation of life and the aesthetic concerns of German idealism. Schelling's articulation of thought, however, is not blindly romantic in that it ignores, or at least problematizes, anthropocentrism. It is unromantic precisely in its assertion that humanity cannot escape the base material nature of existence. As Robert Richards points out in The Romantic Conception of Life, Schelling placed organisms at the center of his philosophy of nature, and set up the absolute, the central entity of his philosophy, as an organically functioning entity. Schelling developed his notion of the organic, and of the absolute as organic, from his contemporaries in the natural sciences, namely Humboldt, Blumenbach, Kielmeyer, and Riehl. However, as Ian Hamilton Grant points out in his Philosophies of Nature after Schelling, Schelling's philosophy cannot be reduced to only the organism, and has its roots in a multitude of issues, and in particular the issue of temporality. As Grant writes, the philosophy of natural history from the 17th to the 19th centuries was structured around the problems of reality as against the phenomenality of time. For Schelling, nature is both product and productivity, the products being formed by two forces opposing one another, the negative force retarding the positive in the form of a whirlpool, which can also be thought of as an infinite development of ideal archetypes in nature, which are attempted in time and space but are never perfectible. In many ways, Schelling's philosophy prefigures metaphysics in that there are productive and restrictive powers in nature, as well as archetypes or patterns. The product and production relation of Schelling's nature should not be seen as supporting the somaticism or body composition of nature, which, as we saw in the last chapter, bioweapon-inspired thought begins to rally against. The question which Grant raises in relation to the biology of Kielmeyer is whether the use of a slime, and protoplasm in particular, always asserts a somaticism, always asserts that microbodies are additive, or that macrobodies, such as viewing the Earth as one organism, are divisible in nature. For Kielmeyer, while bodies or points within nature are pivotal, it is not bodies that are the source and measure of nature, but a net of forces which operate on those bodies, and ultimately on thought. As mentioned in the introduction, Schelling attacked vitalism for being self-contradictory as an unopposed force. He also objected to it being merely an exhaustion of matter. Schelling's rejection of vitalism, however, comes from a classical articulation of vitalism necessitating a rejection of the effects of physics on life as such, a rejection which our formulation here has sought to negate. Our dark vitalism, as inherently spatio-temporal, should alleviate Schelling's second objection, since his own system sought to articulate a nature between mechanism and teleology or finalism. In this sense, we could say that Schelling's nature appears to be partially similar to Bergson's, in that both natures start from a kind of absolute and are divided over time. Kielmayer's thesis that species are a retrogression from a more advanced form fits into this conception of nature as well. Yet Bergson seems to situate the differences of nature primarily in the mind, whereas for Schelling the differences of nature, the teeming darkness of the absolute, is spread over time in an empirical sense. The one of nature must not, however, be taken to be an ideal form, nor must it be seen as a kind of perfect totality of the cosmos. The one must be taken as an obscurity, as the fundamentally unstable beginning of all the processes and entities of the universe. We will address the metaphysical details of this one in the following chapter. For now it is the darkness surrounding the one, that awful absolute, also being the darkness of our dark vitalism, which I will tie to the biological horror of the extra-galactic tyranids. In his text, Difference and Repetition, a text far too dense to fully explicate here, Gilles Deleuze mentions a dark precursor as something that exists prior to all differences, differences which, for Deleuze, exist prior to identity, prior to sameness. In Ian Hamilton Grant's The Chemistry of Darkness, Grant points to this darkness of Deleuze and ties it to the dark absolute of Schelling, this darkness which Hegel and Schlegel ridiculed as too obscure. Nature, for Schelling, is always at least partially buried in eternal darkness. We could also mention Bergson's dark fringe, of a certain film of darkness surrounding our thinking in relation to evolution, where our thinking is around a surface from which the unpredictable springs up and never grasps the internal generative nature of evolution, of nature. This darkness is not merely an obfuscation, but an ongoing challenge to the capacities of thought to think life. Dark vitalism is an alternative to Bergson's combination of idealism and vitalism, and a more realistic take on Schelling's marriage of materialism, or mechanism, with vitalism. Dark vitalism accepts a reality that is fundamentally comprised of forces and processes, but does not attempt to make this contingency or process-dominated reality something that is immediately thinkable or understandable within the limits of reason alone. Dark vitalism, then, is a strange combination of realism and vitalism. The troubled relation of thinking and nature is played out through the relation of the interior and the exterior. As Ian Hamilton Grant writes, the idea is external to the thought that has it. The thought is external to the thinker that has it. The thinker is external to the nature that produces both the thinker and the thought and the idea. For Grant, exteriority is of far more interest than interiority, of the feeling of forms of stratification rather than the fact of stratification itself. Furthermore, thinking can never recount all the details of its production, since the accidental nature of time makes this impossible. But as we saw in the first chapter, interiority cannot be equated with thought, but must grapple with the explosion of life itself from the smallest components. Yet a certain darkness hangs over the possibility of life. It surrounds the difference between the inorganic and the organic. This darkness can be aligned with that of the indiscernibility of matter and the material makeup of life itself. Evolution is not only the stretching of our thinking to absorb the components and capacity of the ooze of life, but also the recognition that thought is only one outcome, one strata of nature itself, and not the necessary end of nature's work towards life. Whether life comes from elsewhere, as a trans-galactic spore, or whether life's individual configurations on separate worlds always lead to similar results, this does not account for the feedback of space and other forms of existence, both organic and inorganic, on how we think life and how thinking life emerges or fails to emerge from ponds of swirling muck. The teeming biological, if beginning from a unity and moving outwards, dividing into ever more chaotic and divergent forms, creates a creeping abyss of biology, where reason is only one feature amidst a taloned and toothed pandemonium.